In the beginning, there was nothing but gray. An endless expanse of fog and formless rock stretched through eternity where time held no meaning and change was an alien concept. This was the Age of Ancients, a period so fundamentally different from anything we understand that describing it requires abandoning our basic assumptions about existence itself. There was no life as we know it, no death to fear, no warmth to seek or cold to flee from. The world existed in a state of perfect, terrible equilibrium. Imagine standing in a place where your shadow doesn't exist because light and dark haven't been invented yet, where the very concept of standing is meaningless because up and down are indistinguishable. This was the reality of the Age of Ancients, ruled by the everlasting dragons, beings that weren't alive in any sense we'd recognize, yet weren't dead either. They simply were, eternal and unchanging as the gray crags and ancient arch trees that formed their domain. The dragons possessed scales of stone that made them immortal, not through regeneration or healing, but through a fundamental immunity to the concept of harm itself. How do you wound something when the very idea of injury doesn't exist? How do you kill what was never truly alive? These weren't creatures that had achieved immortality. They were immortality incarnate, existing in a world where entropy was a foreign concept. Then, in the deepest hollows beneath this gray eternity, something impossible happened. A flame burst into being, not just any flame, but the first flame, a force that would shatter the very foundations of reality. This wasn't merely the introduction of fire to a world of stone. This was the birth of disparity itself, the creation of difference, the shattering of gray uniformity into a spectrum of possibilities that had never existed before. With the first flame came the fundamental forces that would define all existence going forward. Heat and cold suddenly existed as separate states. Life and death became possible, and most importantly, light and dark split the gray world into a battlefield of opposing forces. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. This was creation and destruction wrapped into one cataclysmic instant, a big bang that didn't create matter but created meaning. From the dark that now existed, drawn by the first flame like moths to a light they'd never imagined possible, came the hollows. These weren't the mindless, shambling undead we associate with the term in later ages. These were blank slates of potential, beings that had existed in the dark spaces between the arch trees but had no form, no purpose, no identity until the first flame gave them the possibility of becoming something more. They emerged from the newly created darkness, and among them, 4 would find something that would change the course of history forever. The transformation that was about to unfold wouldn't just be about power or conquest. It would be about the fundamental rewriting of what existence meant, about the price of disparity, and about cycles that would trap the world in an endless loop of fire and dark, death and rebirth, hope and despair. This is the story of the first flame and the ages it created, a tale that begins with a single spark in the darkness and extends through countless cycles of linking, fading, and desperate attempts to maintain or escape the order it established. The Grey Age was ending, though the dragons in their eternal stillness couldn't comprehend that change was even possible. But change had arrived in the form of a flame that would consume everything, including, eventually, itself. The first flame's appearance remains one of Dark Souls' greatest mysteries. Unlike the dragons or the arch trees, which simply existed as part of the primordial landscape, the flame emerged spontaneously from the deep hollows underground. No force summoned it, no will commanded it into being. According to the most ancient accounts we can piece together, it simply happened. A cosmic accident, or perhaps an inevitability that the gray world had been unconsciously waiting for since the beginning of its non-time. What we do know is that the flame fundamentally rewrote the rules of reality at the most basic level. Before its appearance, the world existed in what scholars of this lore often describe as a state of non-existence. Not death, which requires life to define it, but a complete absence of states altogether. The dragons weren't immortal in the way we understand immortality, as an endless extension of life. but existed outside the entire framework where mortality and immortality have meaning. The flame changed this by introducing the concept of disparity, a word that echoes throughout the Dark Souls narrative with profound importance. Disparity doesn't just mean difference, it means the ability for things to be distinguished from one another, for states to exist in opposition and definition to each other. You cannot have heat without cold to compare it to, cannot have life without death to give it meaning, cannot have light without dark to throw it into relief. The first flame didn't just bring fire to the world, it brought the possibility of comparison, of change, of becoming. This fundamental alteration of reality's basic laws created ripples that would define everything that came after. The sterile perfection of the Age of Ancients, where nothing could happen because happening itself didn't exist, shattered like gray stones struck by a hammer. In its place came possibility, potential, and with them, the seeds of every triumph and tragedy that would follow. The hollows that emerged from the dark were the first beneficiaries of this new reality. Before the flame, they had existed in a state even more primordial than the dragons, shapeless, thoughtless, lacking any defining characteristics because characteristics themselves were impossible in the gray world. The flame gave them form, though initially this form was crude and barely distinguished from the darkness they emerged from. They were drawn to the flame not by conscious desire, which would have required thought they didn't yet possess, but by something more fundamental. The basic attraction of undefined potential to the source of definition itself. Most of these hollows remained simple, barely formed things, but 4 of them found something extraordinary within the first flame, the Lord Souls. These weren't just sources of power, though the power they granted was immense. They were crystallizations of the fundamental forces that the flame had brought into being, each one embodying a different aspect of the disparity that now defined reality. The discovery of the Lord's souls marks the true beginning of the Age of Fire, though the dragons still ruled the surface world in their gray eternality. Each soul would shape its finder in profound ways, transforming hollow shells into beings of godlike power and cosmic significance. But more than that, each soul carried within it the seeds of the conflicts that would define the ages to come. Gwyn found the light soul, a force of brilliant incandescence that embodied the positive aspect of the light-dark disparity. With this soul, he became the Lord of Sunlight, a being of such radiant power that he could command lightning itself. Though we should note that the lightning he wielded wasn't electrical in nature as we understand it, but rather concentrated sunlight given physical form. The light soul transformed Gwyn from a hollow into something approaching divinity, granting him not just power but ambition, vision, and the desire to impose order on the chaotic new world the flame had created. The Witch of Izalith claimed the life soul, the embodiment of creation and generation. With it, she became the mother of pyromancy and the progenitor of demons, though the latter was an unintended consequence that wouldn't manifest until much later. The life soul gave her the power to create and nurture, to bring forth new forms of existence from the raw potential the flame had unlocked. She would become the mother of daughters and the architect of a new form of fire manipulation that drew directly from the soul rather than requiring catalysts or divine favor. Gravlord Nito, the first of the dead, took the death soul. This is a particularly interesting case because death itself had just been created by the first flame's introduction of disparity. Nito became death's very embodiment, a being composed of countless skeletons bound together by the power of ending itself. The death soul didn't just give him dominion over the dead, it made him the fundamental force that allowed death to exist as a concept. Without Nito, the death that the flame had made possible would have remained theoretical. The fourth soul, the dark soul, was claimed by the furtive pygmy, a figure so shrouded in mystery that even their name is more description than identification. While the other lords proudly displayed their power and used it to reshape the world, the pygmy took their prize and retreated into obscurity. The dark soul was different from the others, smaller, easily overlooked, yet it contained something the others lacked, the potential for multiplication and inheritance. Many theories exist about why the pygmy remained hidden. Some scholars suggest fear of the other lords, particularly Gwyn, who might have seen the dark soul as a threat to the light. Others propose that the pygmy understood something about their soul that made obscurity necessary, that the dark soul's true power lay not in immediate strength, but in its ability to be passed down, divided among descendants without diminishing, creating what would eventually become humanity itself. The dark soul was unique in another crucial way. While the other Lord Souls represented forces that the first flame had created through disparity, the dark soul seemed to embody the dark that had always existed but only gained meaning when contrasted with light. This made it fundamentally different, perhaps even opposed to the first flame's nature, though it paradoxically couldn't exist without the flame to define it. What we know for certain is that the pygmies' descendants would become humanity, each carrying a fragment of the dark soul within them. What would later be called humanity with a capital H, the dark sprites that players of these histories know so well. This inheritance would make humans unique among all the beings that would populate the world, neither fully of the light like Gwyn's race, nor fully of the dark like the creatures of the abyss, but something in between, capable of choosing their own nature. The four lords, now empowered by their souls, looked up from the hollows below and saw the surface world still ruled by the everlasting dragons. What followed would be the first great war of the New Age, a conflict that would establish the pattern of violence and conquest that disparity had made possible. The dragons, in their eternal stillness, had no concept of war, no understanding of conflict. They were about to learn that the age of ancients was over, and that their stone scales, perfect though they were not immune to the forces the first flame had unleashed. The war against the dragons represents the first true conflict in the history of the world, made possible only by the disparity the first flame introduced. Before the flame, conflict couldn't exist, because there was nothing to fight over, no difference to create opposition, no mortality to threaten or defend. The Lord's challenge to draconic rule wasn't just a war for territory or dominance. It was the violent assertion that the old grey world was dead and a new order had been born. Gwyn led the charge with his Silver Knights, beings he had either created or elevated using the power of his Lord's soul. These weren't the hollow, empty creatures that had first emerged from the dark, but warriors filled with purpose and bathed in their Lord's golden light. They wielded weapons and armor forged from silver, a metal that seemed to channel Gwyn's own luminous power. But conventional weapons proved useless against the dragon's scales of stone, which existed outside the normal framework of damage and destruction. The turning point came with two crucial developments. First, Gwyn discovered or developed the means to peel apart the dragon's stone scales using lightning. The bolts he hurled weren't merely destructive force, but carried within them the concept of disparity itself, the introduction of difference to beings that existed in eternal sameness. When lightning struck a dragon, it didn't just damage them, it introduced the possibility of damage, made their scales capable of being broken by declaring that unbreakable was no longer an absolute state. The second development was betrayal, a concept that, like so much else, the first flame had made possible. Seath the Scaleless, a dragon born without the stone scales that granted his kin immortality, had spent the grey eternities in what we can only imagine was existential agony, aware of his mortality in a world where such awareness was unique torture. When the lords rose to challenge dragon supremacy, Seath saw an opportunity. He betrayed the secrets of his kind to Gwyn, revealing the dragon's weaknesses and fighting alongside the lords against his own kin. The motivations behind Seath's betrayal run deeper than simple survival. Evidence suggests he had already been researching the nature of immortality, driven by his lack of scales to understand what he was missing. The first flame's introduction of disparity gave his research new dimensions. Suddenly, there were different types of immortality to explore, different ways to transcend death. His alliance with Gwyn wasn't just tactical but philosophical, a rejection of the static immortality of dragons in favor of the dynamic, if dangerous, possibilities the flame offered. The Witch of Izalith contributed her mastery of flame sorcery to the war effort. The fire she commanded was different from Gwyn's lightning. where his bolts introduced disparity through pure force of opposing concepts, her flames represented the generative aspect of the first flame, the power of transformation and change. Her daughters stood with her, each a powerful practitioner in their own right, weaving great firestorms that turned the ancient arch trees to ash and cinder. Nito's role in the war speaks to the fundamental change the first flame had wrought. He unleashed death and disease upon the dragons, concepts that shouldn't have been able to affect immortal beings. But the dragon's immortality existed within the old framework, the gray world where death was impossible because life didn't exist to contrast it. Once the flame created the possibility of death, even the everlasting dragons became vulnerable to it, though it required the concentrated power of the death soul itself to affect them. The war raged across the surface world, transforming the landscape from gray stone and ancient trees to a battlefield of light and shadow, fire and ash. Mountains were shattered by Gwyn's lightning, valleys were carved by the witch's flames, and wherever Nito walked, the very ground became infected with mortality. The dragons, for all their everlasting nature, couldn't adapt to this new reality of change and conflict. They fought with the same unchanging patterns they had existed in for eternity, while the lords brought innovation, adaptation, and the cunning that disparity made possible. The furtive pygmies' role in the war remains historically unclear. Some accounts suggest they fought alongside the other lords, using the dark soul in ways that history has forgotten or deliberately obscured. Others claim they took no part, instead using the chaos of the war to spread their descendants, the early humans, across the world while the greater powers were distracted. What we know for certain is that by the war's end, humanity had established itself as a race separate from the lords and their followers, possessed of their own fragment of power in the form of the dark soul. The defeat of the dragons wasn't absolute. Some fled to the edges of the world, hiding in valleys and painted worlds where the full force of the new age couldn't reach them. Calamite, the one-eyed black dragon, would survive in the lands of Ulasile. The ancient dragon in Ash Lake continued its eternal watch over the last grove of arch trees. These survivors became living relics of the Age of Ancients, reminders that the grey world, while conquered, hadn't been completely erased. With the dragons defeated and their rule ended, the Age of Fire began in earnest. Gwyn established Anorlando, the city of the gods, a golden metropolis that stood as a monument to the new order. The Witch of Izalith created her own domain, a place of flame and sorcery, where she continued to explore the powers the life soul granted. Mito descended into the depths, creating the catacombs and becoming the administrator of death itself, ensuring the natural order the flame had created continued to function. The early Age of Fire was, by most accounts, a golden time. The world flourished under the rule of the lords, each maintaining their aspect of the new reality. Cities rose from the ash of burned arch trees. Civilizations developed, and the arts of smithing, sorcery, and miracle working were discovered and refined. The disparity that had shattered the gray world's peace also allowed for creativity, growth, and the pursuit of knowledge that stasis had made impossible. But this golden age carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, planted at the very moment of its creation. The Age of Fire at its height was everything the gray world of the dragons had never been, vibrant, dynamic, filled with possibility and growth. Anorlando stood as its shining capital, a city of impossible architecture where buildings seemed to capture and amplify sunlight itself, where the very stones glowed with warm radiance. The city's grand cathedral reached toward the sky with spires that pierced clouds, while its lower levels descended in careful tiers down mountainsides, each district planned with mathematical precision that spoke to divine intelligence behind its design. Gwyn ruled from this golden city with what appeared to be benevolent authority. He had gathered around him a pantheon of lesser deities and knights, many of them his own children or beings elevated by proximity to his light. His firstborn son, a god of war whose name would later be struck from all records, led the Silver Knights in continued campaigns against the remaining dragons. His daughter Guinevere became a goddess of bounty and fertility, beloved by humans and gods alike for her generous nature. His youngest daughter Gwyndolin, born with an affinity for moon sorcery that troubled the sun god, was raised in shadow but still held a place in the pantheon. The Silver Knights of Gwyn patrolled not just Ain Orlando, but the entire realm, maintaining order and protecting the new civilizations that sprouted in the Age of Fire's light. They were paragons of martial prowess, their techniques in spear and sword work becoming the foundation for military traditions that would persist through countless ages. The four knights of Gwyn, Ornstein, Artorias, Ciaran, and Goff stood above even these elite warriors, each a legend whose deeds would echo through history. Ornstein, the Dragon Slayer, captain of the four knights, wielded lightning with almost as much prowess as Gwyn himself. Artorias, the Abyss Walker, perhaps the most tragic of the four, possessed an unbendable will and swordsmanship that seemed to flow like water. Chiron, the Lord's Blade, moved through shadows despite serving the god of sunlight, her tracers delivering death with surgical precision. Goff, the giant archer, could strike a flying dragon from impossible distances, his great bow singing death across battlefields. Meanwhile, the Witch of Azalit had established her own domain far from Ain Orlando, a place where the study of flame sorcery could proceed without the conservative oversight of Gwyn's court. She and her daughters pushed the boundaries of what the life soul could accomplish, creating new forms of pyromancy that would later spread throughout the world. The demon ruins that we know today as a place of corruption and chaos were once gardens of fire, where flame danced in harmony with life, where lava flowed and controlled channels that nurtured rather than destroyed. The witches' daughters each developed their own specialties within the flame arts. Quelag and Quellan, who would later suffer terrible transformation, were once beautiful practitioners who could weave fire into forms of impossible delicacy. The Fair Lady, as Quellan would come to be known, had a particular gift for healing flames, fire that restored rather than consumed. Their sister, Quellana, would become the mother of pyromancy as humans would come to practice it, though that development was still ages in the future. Nito, in his realm beneath the earth, performed a function that the living rarely appreciated, but desperately needed. Death, newly created by the first flame's disparity, required administration. Without Nito's guiding hand, the dead might not stay dead, might rise as hollow abominations, or might simply cease to exist entirely rather than passing to whatever came after. The Gravlord maintained the boundary between life and death, ensuring that the cycle the flame had initiated continued properly. During this golden age, humanity flourished as well, though in a position distinctly subordinate to the gods. Humans built their own kingdoms and cities, always in the shadow of Ain Orlando, but still magnificent in their own right. New Londo, constructed by human architects with knowledge gifted by the gods, rivaled even divine construction in its beauty. The city of Ulakile became a center of learning and sorcery, where human mages explored arts that even the gods found fascinating. But beneath this prosperity lay growing tensions that would eventually tear the Age of Fire apart. The most fundamental of these was the nature of humanity itself, carrying as it did fragments of the dark soul. While Gwyn and the other lords drew their power from souls aligned with the first flame, humanity's power came from the dark, not evil necessarily, but fundamentally opposed to the light that Gwyn championed. The first signs of Gwyn's paranoia about humanity appeared in small ways. Restrictions on human advancement in certain fields, limitations on how high they could build their cities, subtle discouragements from exploring certain types of magic. The gods framed these as protections, safety measures to prevent humans from harming themselves with powers they couldn't fully control. But many scholars believe Gwyn had already recognized that the dark soul, multiplying through human generations while the Lord souls remained static, would eventually rival and perhaps surpass the gods' power. The creation of the Ringed City represents perhaps the clearest example of Gwyn's dual nature toward humanity. Generosity twisted with fear. He gifted the city to the Pygmies, the direct descendants of the furtive pygmy who still carried the largest fragments of the dark soul. On its surface, it was a magnificent gift, a city at the world's edge where humanity could rule itself free from divine interference. But the city was also a prison, sealed away at the end of the world where humanity's dark power could be contained and monitored. The gift came with a brand, the seal of fire that Gwyn placed upon humanity's darkness. This seal would later evolve into or inspire the dark sign, though the exact relationship between the two remains debated among scholars. What we know is that Gwyn marked humanity with fire, suppressing their natural darkness beneath a ring of flame. The act was presented as a blessing, but it was fundamentally about control, about preventing humanity from accessing the full potential of the dark soul. As ages passed in the Age of Fire, and we must remember that these ages were vast, potentially thousands of years each, subtle changes began to manifest. The first flame, that source of all disparity and change, was itself beginning to fade. The process was slow, barely noticeable at first, but the gods, with their extended perception, began to recognize the signs. Colors seemed less vibrant, the distinction between states less absolute, and in the deepest philosophical sense, the world was beginning to trend back toward the gray uniformity from which it had emerged. This fading terrified Gwyn more than any dragon or demon ever could. The Age of Fire wasn't just his kingdom, it was the fundamental order of reality as he understood it. Without the first flame, without the disparity it created, would the world revert to the Age of Ancients? Would the gods themselves, born from the flame's power, simply cease to exist? Or would something else emerge, something dark, something human? The Witch of Izalith was the first to attempt a solution. Her plan was audacious in its simplicity. If the first flame was fading, why not create a replacement? She possessed the life soul, the power of creation itself. Surely, she reasoned, she could birth a new flame to replace the old, maintaining the Age of Fire through her own generative power. The fact that the first flame had emerged from nothing, from no creator or source that anyone could identify, should have given her pause. But desperation and hubris are a powerful combination. The witch's attempt to create a new first flame represents one of the most catastrophic failures in recorded history. Rather than recreating the first flame, she birthed something else entirely, the flame of chaos, a corrupted life force that transformed rather than created, that consumed rather than sustained. The witch herself was transformed into the bed of chaos, a tree-like abomination that would become the mother of all demons. Her daughters were caught in a blast of chaotic transformation, most becoming spider-like demons, fusions of beauty and horror that reflected the twisted nature of their mother's failed flame. The birth of the Chaos Flame had consequences that rippled throughout the Age of Fire. Demons, beings that shouldn't exist according to the natural order, began spawning from the bed of chaos and spreading throughout the underground. These weren't creatures of the dark or the light, but something else, something wrong, born from the attempt to artificially recreate what had emerged naturally. The kingdom of Izalith was transformed into what we now know as the Demon Ruins, a hellscape of lava and twisted stone where the laws of nature bent and broke. Kulana, the one daughter of the witch who escaped transformation, fled to the swamps of Blighttown, carrying with her the knowledge of pyromancy, but also the terrible weight of her family's failure. She would later teach this art to humans, perhaps as penance, perhaps as hope that someone might succeed where her mother had failed. The pyromancy she taught was different from her mother's flame sorcery. More controlled, less ambitious, drawing from the inner flame of the soul rather than attempting to channel the first flame itself. Gwyn watched the witch's failure with what we can only imagine was a mixture of horror and vindication. Her attempt had not only failed, but had created a new threat to his order. But more importantly, it had proven that the first flame couldn't be replaced or recreated through conventional means. If the Age of Fire was to continue, a different solution was needed. What Gwyn chose to do next would echo through every age that followed, creating a cycle that would trap the world in an endless loop of death and rebirth, hope and despair. His solution was sacrifice, but not just any sacrifice. He would offer himself, the Lord of Sunlight with his powerful soul, as fuel to feed the fading first flame. The decision to link the first flame wasn't made lightly. Gwyn understood that feeding himself to the flame would fundamentally change him, would reduce the Lord of Sunlight to a hollow shell of his former glory. But he believed, or perhaps desperately hoped, that his sacrifice would reignite the first flame permanently, that the power of a Lord's soul would be sufficient to restore the fire to its original strength. Before his departure for the kiln of the first flame, where the fire had first emerged all those ages ago, Gwyn divided his Lord's soul among his most trusted followers. To the 4 kings of New Londo, he granted fragments of power that would allow them to rule in his absence. To Seath the Scaleless, he bequeathed the piece along with the title of Duke, legitimizing the dragon's place in the new order. Other fragments went to his children and knights, ensuring that even without him, some vestige of his power would remain to maintain order. But Gwyn's greatest concern was humanity and the dark soul they carried. His paranoia about the dark had only grown as the first flame faded, and he feared what humans might become in the age of dark that would follow if the flame died entirely. So alongside his sacrifice, he enacted one final measure of control. He placed a seal of fire upon humanity itself, what would become known as the Dark Sign. The Dark Sign was Gwyn's most insidious creation, though whether its full effects were intentional or an unintended consequence of his desperation remains debated. This ring of fire, branded upon humanity, would activate when the first flame began to fade. Those branded would become undead, unable to truly die, constantly reviving but losing a piece of themselves each time, their memories, their purpose, eventually their very humanity, until they became hollow shells mindlessly wandering the world. The curse served multiple purposes from Gwyn's perspective. First, it prevented humans from dying and potentially strengthening the dark soul through their accumulated darkness. Second, it gradually stripped them of their humanity, the very thing that made them dangerous to the God's order. Third, it created a mechanism by which strong undead would be driven to link the fire themselves, continuing the cycle Gwyn was about to begin. When Gwyn finally entered the kiln of the first flame and offered himself as fuel, the results were both successful and catastrophic. The first flame did indeed surge back to life, fed by the power of the Lord's soul. The age of fire continued, saved from immediate collapse into darkness. But Gwyn himself was reduced to a hollow lord, a cinder of his former self who would spend eternity guarding the flame, attacking any who approached as if protecting it, even from those who might seek to link it themselves. More significantly, Gwyn's linking of the fire created a precedent, a cycle that would define the world going forward. The first flame would burn, fed by powerful souls, then begin to fade. As it faded, the undead curse would spread, creating a population of immortal beings driven by prophecy and desperation to seek powerful souls. Eventually, one would prove strong enough to reach the kiln and link the fire themselves, starting the process anew. This was Gwyn's greatest sin. Not just his sacrifice, but the system he created that would demand sacrifice from countless others across the ages. The natural order, whatever it might have been, was replaced with an artificial cycle that perpetuated the age of fire at terrible cost. Every linking of the fire was weaker than the last, each revival of the flame shorter, until by the time of the Third Age chronicled in the histories, the world itself was collapsing from the strain of constant death and rebirth. The undead curse that Gwyn created, or unleashed, depending on one's interpretation, became the defining tragedy of the Dark Souls world. To understand its full horror, we must examine not just what it does to individuals, but how it reshapes entire civilizations and the very meaning of existence itself. When the first flame begins to fade in any given cycle, the dark sign appears seemingly at random among the human population. There's no moral component to its selection. Saints and sinners alike can be branded. The mark itself appears as a ring of fire burned into the flesh, often on the back or chest, impossible to hide, and immediately recognizable to those who know its significance. In some kingdoms, the appearance of the dark sign was grounds for immediate exile or execution, though killing an undead proved futile, as they would simply return. The curse operates on multiple levels of cruelty. First comes the physical immortality, the inability to die. While this might seem like a blessing, it quickly reveals itself as torment. Each death is still painful, still traumatic, but followed by resurrection at the last bonfire the undead rested at. These bonfires, fragments of the first flame scattered throughout the world, serve as anchor points for the undead soul, drawing it back from death again and again. But resurrection comes with a cost. Each death strips away a piece of the undead's humanity, those dark sprites that represent fragments of the dark soul. Humanity isn't just a metaphysical concept, but the very essence of what makes someone human, their memories, emotions, connections to others, and sense of self. As an undead dies repeatedly, they begin to hollow, losing these essential aspects of their identity. The hollowing process is gradual but inevitable for most undead. First, they might forget small details, the name of a childhood friend, the taste of a favorite meal. Then larger memories disappear, the faces of loved ones, the purpose that once drove them. Eventually, even basic cognitive functions fade until the undead becomes fully hollow, a mindless husk that attacks anything it perceives, driven by instincts it no longer understands. The genius of Gwyn's curse, if we can call such cruelty genius, lies in how it manipulates the dark soul within humanity. The dark sign acts as a drain, slowly bleeding the darkness from branded humans while the ring of fire contains what remains. This serves the dual purpose of weakening humanity's connection to the dark soul, while also creating beings desperate enough to seek any solution, including linking the first flame themselves. Throughout history, various civilizations have attempted different approaches to managing the undead curse. The Way of White, a religious organization devoted to Gwyn's legacy, preached that undeath was a trial from the gods, that maintaining one's purpose and faith could stave off hollowing. They organized undead pilgrimages to Lordran, the land where the first flame resided, encouraging undead to seek their destiny there rather than hollowing in populated areas. Other kingdoms took harsher approaches. The undead were rounded up and imprisoned in asylums, massive fortress prisons where they could hollow without threatening the living population. The undead asylum in Lordran became the most notorious of these, where undead were thrown into cells and forgotten, left to slowly lose themselves over centuries of isolation. The cruelty of this practice was justified as protecting the greater good, but it also reflected humanity's deep fear of what the curse represented. Some undead found ways to maintain their sanity despite the curse. Strong purpose or duty could anchor an undead's mind, preventing or at least slowing the hollowing process. We see this in figures like the crestfallen warrior who maintains his cognition through sheer cynicism and observation, or merchants who focus on their trade as a way to maintain identity. But these are temporary measures at best. Eventually, all undead hollow unless they find a more permanent solution. The consumption of humanity sprites could reverse hollowing temporarily, restoring an undead's human appearance and some of their mental faculties. This created a grotesque economy where humanity became a commodity, traded and hoarded by those seeking to maintain their sanity. Some undead turned to darker methods, invading other worlds to steal humanity from others, becoming the very monsters they sought to avoid becoming. The dark sign also had broader implications for the cycle of fire and dark. By preventing human death and gradually stripping away humanity, it weakened the overall power of the dark soul distributed among humankind. This may have been Gwyn's ultimate intention, not just to create soldiers for the first flame, but to fundamentally cripple humanity's potential to usher in an age of dark. Every hollow wandering mindlessly through the world represented a fragment of the dark soul effectively neutralized, unable to contribute to humanity's collective power. The relationship between the dark sign and the natural order reveals the depth of Gwyn's transgression against the fundamental laws the first flame itself had established. Fire and dark were meant to exist in disparity, in balance and opposition. By using fire to suppress and drain the dark, Gwyn created an abomination that violated the very principle that gave him his power in the first place. The dark sign wasn't just a curse, it was a cosmic perversion, a wound in reality that bled darkness while burning with unnatural fire. Consider the psychological torture, the curse inflicted on entire societies. In kingdoms where the curse appeared, families were torn apart as branded members were cast out or voluntarily exiled themselves to protect their loved ones. Children watched parents slowly forget their names. Spouses witnessed their partners become hollow shells of their former selves. The social fabric that held civilizations together unraveled as trust became impossible. Anyone could be branded. Anyone could become a mindless hollow given enough time and death. The prophecies that arose around the undead curse served as both hope and manipulation. The most famous of these, the prophecy of the chosen undead, spoke of a branded one who would ring the bells of awakening and succeed Lord Gwyn, either linking the fire or ushering in the Age of Dark. Whether this prophecy was genuine foresight or clever propaganda designed to motivate powerful undead toward linking the fire remains debated. Oscar of Astora, who freed the chosen undead from the asylum, believed in it deeply enough to use his final moments ensuring it could come to pass. But the prophecy itself raises disturbing questions. How many chosen undead have there been across the cycles? Evidence suggests hundreds, perhaps thousands, each believing themselves to be the subject of prophecy, most failing somewhere along the pilgrimage to link the fire. The prophecy might simply be a numbers game. Tell enough undead they're chosen, and eventually one will prove strong enough to complete the journey. The bells themselves, one in the heights of the undead parish, another in the depths of Quelag's domain, served as tests to separate the truly powerful undead from the masses. Only those who could overcome the challenges guarding each bell would prove strong enough to claim the Lord souls necessary for linking the fire. The entire structure of Lordran, from the placement of demons to the locations of Lord Soul fragments, seems designed to create a gauntlet that would produce an undead of sufficient power. This system reveals a horrible truth about the Age of Fire's continuation. It wasn't maintained through divine providence or natural order, but through a carefully constructed mechanism that harvested the suffering and determination of countless undead to produce occasional candidates strong enough to serve as fuel. The world itself had been transformed into a machine for producing sacrifice. The variations of the curse across different cycles added new dimensions of horror. In some ages, the curse spread slowly, allowing kingdoms time to adapt and develop containment strategies. In others, it appeared suddenly and virulently, transforming entire populations into undead within a single generation. The curse seemed to respond to the flame's level of fading. The weaker the flame became, the more aggressive the curse in creating undead to potentially link it. By the time of the Second Age chronicled in the histories of Drangleic, the curse had become so endemic that entire kingdoms rose and fell based on their ability to manage undead populations. King Vendrick sought to overcome the curse through his own means, stealing something precious from the giants across the sea and using their power to build a kingdom that could withstand the hollowing of its citizens. His failure, hollowing himself despite all his preparations, demonstrated that even the mightiest kings couldn't escape Gwyn's curse. The Third Age, the Age of Lords of Cinder, showed the ultimate degradation of the linking system. The first flame had been linked so many times, fed so many powerful souls, that it began to reject the sacrifice of normal undead. Only Lords of Cinder beings who had successfully linked the fire in previous cycles and been resurrected for this purpose possessed sufficient power to serve as fuel. But even they began to refuse their duty, abandoning their thrones rather than submit to burning again. This refusal speaks to another aspect of the curse's cruelty. Those who successfully linked the fire didn't find peace or release, but became Lords of Cinder, bound to the flame eternally, capable of being resurrected whenever the fire needed them. Prince Lothric's refusal to link the fire, choosing to let it fade rather than perpetuate the cycle, represented a philosophical rejection of the entire system Gwyn had created. "Let them grant death to the old gods of Lordran," he declared, "deliverers of the first flame." The unkindled, those who had attempted to link the fire but proved insufficient as fuel, represented yet another variation of the curse. Resurrected not as undead, but as something even less, they were ash given form, beings who had failed once and were granted a second chance to serve the flame's hunger. They couldn't even hollow properly, denied even that escape from their purpose. The true insidiousness of the dark sign lay in how it made Gwyn's artificial order self-perpetuating. As long as humans existed with fragments of the dark soul, the curse would create undead when the flame faded. As long as undead existed, some would eventually prove strong enough to link the fire. As long as the fire was linked, the age of fire would continue, however diminished. The cycle had become a prison for the entire world, and the dark sign was its lock. The endless cycle that Gwyn's linking created transformed the world from a place of linear history to one of repetitive ages, each a diminished echo of the last. To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we must examine how the cycle operated across multiple linkings and the degradation it caused to the very fabric of reality. Each linking of the first flame followed a predictable pattern, though the specific details varied. The flame would burn bright for a time, centuries or millennia, depending on the strength of the soul that fed it. During this period, kingdoms would rise, civilizations would flourish, and the curse would recede to the point where some generations might forget it entirely. These were the golden periods between linkings, when the world could pretend the age of fire was eternal and unchanging. But inevitably, the flame would begin to fade again. The signs were always similar, colors growing muted, the sun appearing dimmer, and most tellingly, the appearance of the dark sign among the human population. What started as isolated cases would become an epidemic. Kingdoms that had prospered for generations would collapse within decades as their populations became undead. The infrastructure of civilization, built on the assumption of mortality and generational succession, would crumble when death ceased to have meaning. The lords of Cinder throughout history each represent different approaches to and philosophies about the linking. The Abyss Watchers, an entire legion who linked the fire as one, did so out of duty to prevent the spread of the abyss, ironically fighting the dark with such fervor that they fed themselves to the fire that suppressed it. Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, linked the fire, despite his visions of an age of deep waters that would follow the fire's fading, perhaps hoping to prevent that dark future. Yhorm the Giant linked the flame to save his people, only for them to be destroyed anyway by the profaned flame that emerged from their misunderstanding of fire's nature. Each linking was weaker than the last because the first flame itself was degrading. The fire that Gwyn had linked was the original, pure manifestation of disparity. But each time it was rekindled with a Lord's soul or powerful being, it became more artificial, more removed from its original nature. The flame was burning through the foundational energy of the world itself, consuming the very disparity it had created in an endless hunger that grew with each feeding. This degradation manifested in the physical world as well. By the Third Age, the lands themselves had begun to converge and overlap. Lothric Castle stood where Anor Londo once was, or perhaps they existed in the same space simultaneously. The Drek heap at the world's end showed all of history collapsed into one point, buildings and landscapes from different eras existing impossibly together. Time itself had become convoluted, a phrase that echoed through the ages as reality buckled under the strain of endless repetition. The converging lands revealed a horrible truth. The cycle wasn't just temporal but spatial. Each linking didn't restore the world, but created a new iteration layered on top of the old. The world was literally collapsing under the weight of its own history, unable to support the endless repetitions of the same age. Geography became fluid, with kingdoms that should be continents apart appearing next to each other, connected by impossible passages that defied conventional understanding of space. Scholar after scholar attempted to break the cycle through different means. Some sought to strengthen the flame permanently, the Witch of Izalis' attempt being the most catastrophic example. Others looked for ways to bypass it entirely. The Sable Church of Lundor promoted the idea of usurpation, of an undead claiming the first flame's power rather than simply feeding it, becoming a Lord of Hollows who could rule an age of neither fire nor dark, but something else, something fundamentally broken. The Painted Worlds represented another attempt to escape the cycle. These pocket dimensions, created through powerful paintings, offered refuge from the larger world's endless repetition. The painted world of Ariamis, and later the painted world of Ariandel, served as havens for things that didn't fit in the regular cycle. The half-dragon Priscilla, the forlorn spirits who had lost their place in the world, and eventually those who sought to create a new world entirely, painted with the dark soul itself. But even these painted worlds couldn't truly escape the cycle's influence. They too would rot and fade, requiring fire to burn them away so they could be painted anew. Sister Frida's desperate attempts to prevent the burning of Ariandel only prolonged its decay, creating a frozen world of endless stagnation that mirrored the larger world's problem, the fear of change leading to a worse fate than the change itself would bring. The most tragic aspect of the cycle was how it corrupted everything it touched. Noble intentions became twisted over repetitions. The Way of White, founded to honor Gwyn and maintain order, became the corrupt, deep faith of Aldrich's followers. The Abyss Watchers, dedicated to preventing the dark spread, became so consumed by their mission that they would slaughter entire kingdoms on mere suspicion of corruption. Even the concept of heroism itself became perverted. What was heroic about perpetuating a cycle that caused such suffering? Some beings found ways to exist outside or parallel to the cycle. The primordial serpents, Kingseeker Frampt and Darkstalker Kyathi, seemed to transcend the normal rules, appearing across multiple ages with their own agendas. Frampt encouraged the linking of the fire, while Kyathi promoted its fading and the coming of the Age of Dark. Whether they were truly independent actors or simply another part of the cycle's mechanism remains one of the great mysteries. The dragons that survived from the Age of Ancients watched the cycle with what we can only imagine was a mixture of satisfaction and horror. They had existed in unchanging eternity, and now they witnessed the world that had replaced theirs trapped in its own kind of stasis. Not the peaceful gray of before, but a tortured repetition of rise and fall, hope and despair. The ancient dragon in Ash Lake, meditating among the last arch trees, might have been the only being that remembered what existence was like before the first flame's curse of disparity. By the time of the final cycles chronicled in the histories, the world had been so thoroughly broken by repetition that the fundamental laws of reality had begun to fail. The sun existed as a literal ball of darkness in the sky, light and dark having been so twisted together that they became indistinguishable. The first flame itself had shrunk to barely an ember, requiring the combined souls of multiple lords of cinder just to sputter back to temporary life. The Ashen One's journey, the last champion's path through the converged lands, represented perhaps the final iteration of the cycle. The world was literally ending, collapsing into the dreg heap where all of history compressed into a single point. The choice presented at the end of this journey carried more weight than any previous linking or refusal because there might not be a world left for another cycle. The endings available to this final champion each represented different philosophies about the cycle and its resolution. Linking the fire one more time, though the flame was so weak it would likely last only moments before fading again. Letting it fade naturally, ushering in an age of dark that had been postponed for so long. Usurping the flame, becoming something new and unnatural. Or, in the final revelations of the Ringed City, finding the dark soul itself, the blood of the pygmy lords dried and flaking, and presenting it to the painter of a new world. A world that might exist free from the cycle's curse. As we reach the end of this chronicle of fire and ages, we must grapple with the fundamental questions the cycle raises about the nature of existence itself. Was the first flame's appearance truly random, or was it inevitable? Could the world have transitioned naturally from the Age of Fire to the Age of Dark without Gwyn's intervention, or would that transition have meant the complete unmaking of reality as the Lords understood it? The first flame gave the world meaning through disparity, but that meaning came at the cost of eternal conflict between opposing forces. Light and dark, life and death, heat and cold. These weren't just different states, but actively opposing principles locked in endless struggle. Gwyn's sin wasn't just in trying to preserve the Age of Fire, but in refusing to accept that disparity itself meant that no single state could or should exist forever. By trying to make the Age of Fire eternal, he violated the very principle that created it. The dark soul, carried by humanity, represented possibility in a way the other Lord Souls didn't. While Gwyn's light was singular and dominant, Nito's death was final and absolute, and the witch's life was generative but chaotic. The dark soul could be divided infinitely without weakening, could adapt and change while maintaining its essential nature. Humanity's darkness wasn't evil. It was potential, creativity, the ability to exist in the spaces between absolutes. The tragedy of the dark sign and the cycles wasn't just the suffering they caused, but the potential they destroyed. What might humanity have become if allowed to develop naturally? What kind of age might have followed if the transition from fire to dark had been permitted to occur without Gwyn's interference? These questions haunt the ruins of every civilization destroyed by the curse, echo in the hollow moans of every undead who lost themselves to the cycle. The painted worlds offered a glimpse of what might be possible, new worlds created from the essence of the dark soul, painted with the blood of those who possessed the largest fragments of humanity's inheritance. These worlds wouldn't be perfect, would still rot and require renewal, but that renewal could come naturally rather than through the forced repetition of the linking cycle. The painter in the attic, working on a new world that would be a cold, dark, and very gentle place, represented hope for something beyond the binary of fire and dark. The beauty and horror of Dark Souls' cosmology lies in how it reflects fundamental truths about existence, while wrapping them in dark fantasy. The fear of change, the desire to preserve what we have even when that preservation causes suffering, the way power systems perpetuate themselves at the cost of those they ostensibly serve. These themes resonate because they mirror patterns we recognize in our own world, though thankfully without undead curses and hollow transformations. The First Flame's story is ultimately about consequences that echo across eternity. One moment of creation, the flame's first spark, set in motion everything that followed. One moment of fear, Gwyn's decision to link the fire, created a cycle that would consume countless souls across innumerable ages. The smallest choices, made in desperation or hope, can reshape reality itself. As we consider the lords and humans, the dragons and demons, the knights and undead who populated this dark history, we see that each was shaped by forces beyond their control, while simultaneously making choices that would affect forces beyond their comprehension. The chosen undead who rang the bells and challenged Gwyn had no way of knowing whether linking the fire or walking away would truly break the cycle or simply continue it in a different form. They could only choose based on their own understanding, their own philosophy about what the world should be. And perhaps that's the deepest truth buried in the lore of the First Flame and the ages, that in a universe defined by disparity, by the conflict between opposing forces, the power to choose between those forces might be the greatest power of all. Whether that choice is to preserve the light, embrace the dark, or seek something entirely new, the ability to make that choice, to exercise will in a world that seems determined by cosmic forces and ancient curses, represents the ultimate expression of what the First Flame made possible when it introduced disparity to the gray world. The fire fades, as it always has and always will, but the story of the First Flame and the ages it created continues to burn in the memories of those who've walked these dark paths, kindled bonfires in the depths of despair, and faced the choice between fire and dark with nothing but their own conviction to guide them. The age you choose, the flame you kindle or abandon, the world you paint or destroy. These choices echo through eternity just as Gwyn's choice did, creating ripples in the fabric of existence that will shape whatever comes next, whether that's another cycle, an age of dark, or something entirely new that neither the dragons nor the lords could have imagined. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the tragic cosmology of Dark Souls, the mystery of the First Flame, and the endless cycles it spawned, please like and subscribe to Keen 7 Lore for more comprehensive explorations of gaming's deepest lore and most fascinating stories. We delve into the histories, mysteries, and philosophical depths of the world you love, uncovering the hidden connections and profound themes that make these digital realms so compelling. Until next time, don't you dare go hollow.